All right, I think we're gonna. Oh, all right, good. Wasn't a surprise, right?
Well, thank you. Glad you're here, and some of you are here virtually. I'd like to introduce our special guest. I'm Steve Burnstein, by the way, the president of Solel in Fort Worth, South Carolina. We meet at Grace Friends, which is like 1116 by 460. And we have a special guest to tell us what's happening, positive news from Israel. And Rabbi Steve Burnstein, he's with Kehilat Birkat Shalom in Israel. The title of his presentation is Israel Through the Eyes of My Children. He's the spiritual leader of Kehilat Birkat Shalom at Kibbutz Gezer in Israel, and he's a member of Birkat, is a member of the Israeli Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism in Central Israel. Former Director of Global Leadership Development and Education for the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which is an international umbrella for URJ. And he lives at the kibbutz with his wife and kids. And he enjoys certain things, and I suspect you're going to show one of those, so I should give away. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so great to be back. The answer to everything about living in Israel is it's complicated. Even when we travel outside of Israel, to get here, it's complicated. With the flights and the jet lag and all of the changes. I've been in Israel for a little over 25 years now. We're constantly saying, Yetov, it'll be okay. Everything's going to be all right. We have Hatikva, the great hope that everything is going to get better. And we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and 2 steps, and we've just taken a pretty big step back, many of us believe, in the last couple of weeks. But I want to focus for right now. My mother-in-law, who died a little over a year ago at the age of 96, used to say that you make Aliyah every day. She was in Israel in the 1940s when she first made Aliyah. And that's where she met my father-in-law, also of blessed memory. My father-in-law was a crew member on the Exodus. They were together founders of a kibbutz in the north of Israel called Sasa. Then they went back to the States for a number of years before coming back to Israel again in the 70s and staying. And she always said, you make Aliyah every day. Because every day something happens. And anybody who's ever heard me speak, I always mention this. Every day something happens here as well that makes me say, how can I live in this place? How can I possibly live in a country, in a city, in a place where people behave like this? Where people, for each one of us, the this might be very different. But how can I live in this place because of what is happening? We all feel. But then she says, and then something else happens. It makes me say, how could I possibly live anywhere else? And I want to spend most of my time this evening talking about those amazing things that happen that make me say, how could I possibly live anyplace else? But it's complicated. And for tonight, I want to focus on also, it's even more complicated, raising children in Israel. So for example, years ago, after I made Aliyah, the first time that there were rockets coming into Israel, my office at the time was within range. And I got used to it. My office actually in our building was the safe room, was the bomb shelter. So everybody would come running to me. I'd pull out the guitar and we'd start singing to try to keep people calm. We'd wait and there was a battery of the Iron Dome rockets, if you're familiar with it, the rockets that we purchased from the United States in order to shoot down the missiles that were coming at us. So at the entrance to the campus of where my office was, there was a battery of these Iron Dome missiles with a squadron around protecting them. And it really didn't have a big impact on me, which kind of surprised me. A few years later, when the missile technology in Gaza got a little bit more sophisticated, and Kibbutz Gezer, where I live halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, was suddenly in range. Now I was seeing it through the eyes of my children. I was watching my son keep shoes next to the bed and sleep in his pants and in his socks because he didn't want to have to worry about having to get dressed quickly. It was before we now have a bomb shelter at our house. It's my daughter's room because it's impossible to wake her up if she's sound asleep. So at the time, we would have to run next door to a bomb shelter. And I would grab a bottle of scotch because we were, I had to bring a host gift for the host or the hostess. And scotch seemed like a good one if we were running from missiles. But watching the impact on my children changed everything. A few months afterwards, we went and we were visiting family who live in Rockland County in New York, in a village called Congers next to Nyack. And they have a volunteer fire department. And if they need to call the volunteer fire department, they don't only get messages on their phone or their beepers. There's a local siren that goes off. The first time we were there, and we're sitting around at my brother and sister-in-law's house, schmoozing, and the siren goes off, the four of us, my son, my daughter, my wife, and I, jumped up trying to figure out where are we supposed to run. The impact is real. It gets even more complicated. My rabbinic colleagues in the United States have plenty of problems around the world. One of the things they don't have to worry about is the possibility of getting arrested for doing a wedding. Every time I do a wedding in Israel as a non-Orthodox rabbi, technically I'm breaking the law. Not only could I be arrested, but the couple, part of the premarital counseling before the ceremony is, what you're doing is illegal. You could get arrested for doing this. Each one of us is praying to be the first one to get arrested for it, but that's aside. But my kids know that. My kids know that there are people in the Orthodox community who, if they knew when I was walking by that I was a Reform rabbi, they might get violent, verbally, physically, they might spit, they might not. But my kids are aware of that. Seeing it through my children's eyes, it's complicated. But my kids are amazing. Another level of complication is that both of my kids are in the Army now. So Micah, who's the oldest, he's 21. Micah is on the autism spectrum. Very high-functioning autism. He is in a program called Ro'im Rachok. Ro'im Rachok means lirot, to see. Rachok is from a distance. It's the name of this intelligence unit I don't know a lot of details. He loves being able to tell me, oh, I can't tell you or I'd have to kill you. But he goes to the equivalent of the Israeli Pentagon, the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, every day. And he has an office with other soldiers where they're doing things that includes analyzing satellite imagery, looking for subtle changes in topography and other things that the computers don't catch. And it would drive me bonkers to do this detail-oriented, repetitive work, but he thrives. And he's in a specialized unit within his unit that does something with teaching artificial intelligence to recognize objects, right? There's a big thing. Is it a minivan or is it an elephant? The computer doesn't know. And one of the things they do is try to help the computer figure that out. Beyond that, I don't know a whole lot other than my next door neighbor, right? If I'm sitting in my living room, my back, and sitting on the sofa, and there's a wall behind me, if I knock on the wall, that's the living room of my neighbor Amos and Lisa. And Amos is a very high-ranking combat soldier. In reserve duty, but constantly active. And when he heard what Micah was doing in the army, he came over and he said, Micah, I want to shake your hand. He said, you don't understand, and at this point he was talking to me, he said, you don't understand how important what your son is doing in the army is. But for my soldiers in my unit, they're helping to save lives. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. And my son, who raising a child who's not neurotypical, and who also, some of you may know, both of our children are adopted of Ethiopian descent. Raising a child who's got special needs, who's not the same color as most of his friends and family, increases, it's complicated. And the worry factor. He takes a bus on his own every day to Tel Aviv, a couple of buses. He goes out and meets friends to go drinking or to go to a restaurant. He's gained a degree of self-confidence and independence that I was never sure he would have. And it wasn't, the program started as a project, we want everyone to feel part of Israeli society and to feel included. So let's create something for different groups of people with special or different needs. Then they discovered that there was a need for some of the skills that people like Micah had, where it wasn't just to make them and us feel good that they're part of society, but it was actually contributing so that Amos, as Amos said, we're saving lives. And by the way, it doesn't hurt to know that I just recently heard that, have you ever heard of Mobileye? Technology company that develops the self-driving cars, and the technology that if you went out of your lane, right, the car beeps, you get too close, somebody behind you or whatever. So that company is looking for people who have the skills that Micah has and that he's learning and doing in the army. So he's responsible for our retirement. So I can come back to Micah, but I want to talk a little bit about Gavriella. So Gavriella, my baby girl, is 20. She's a handful. I blame my mother. My mother always said when I was little, just you wait, right? Someday you'll have a kid just like you, and boy, did that happen. She can't sit still. She can't stop talking. She has a hard time holding it in, even if what she wants to say is totally inappropriate to the person she wants to say it to, which can be even more complicated now that she's in the army. But she is a great kid, and through high school, because she was always moving and bouncing around, she ended up becoming a dancer. Modern dance, ballet, working with a very serious dance group. We were schlepping her a week. My wife was schlepping her, and occasionally I would help 5 times a week to hours and hours and hours of dance. And she was debating about whether she wanted to be a dancer. So in the Israeli army, there are a handful of people who have talents, whether it's sports or the arts, where you can get what's called hitztayanut, okay? So a real quick Hebrew lesson, okay? You've all heard of maybe Zion, right? The Church of Zion, or Zion, Mount Zion, right? Zion is a place that it represents excellence, okay? If I get my grades, that's my tziyun. Okay? How excellent am I? Measuring that. Okay? So hitztayanut means you are so good that the country, the military, is willing to invest in you to continue your development in that field as part of your military service. And she was being pushed in that direction for dance, but she said, I'll have more time to dance. This is the time when I need to be doing other things. And then she scared me to death because she wanted to be in, she loves animals, and she wanted to be in the dog unit. So the dog unit in the army isn't walking around an airport, okay? It's sending dogs in to situations where I don't want my little, she didn't want to be the trainer, she wanted to be the handler. And I didn't want my daughter to be in those kinds of situations. Thank God, unlike her father, her problem was she didn't weigh enough to be accepted into the special combat unit, because that's considered an elite combat unit, working with the dogs because of the situations they have to go into. She didn't weigh enough to get it. That was a very happy day. She ended up being selected to become a fitness trainer for elite combat soldiers. Because of, in high school in Israel, you major, right? And she did above and beyond a regular major. Most people, when they major, they do a certain number of units. She did several units beyond that in dance that includes anatomy and physiology and, all kinds of things beyond just, a pirouette. So she had the background, the understanding, and the training to set her up to be in a good position to get the additional training to become a personal fitness trainer. So she's at a base in the south of Israel. She had over 100 of these big macho guys who come down there, and in order to move to the next level of their training, one of the things that happens on this base is they then get introduced to Gavriella, who is this very thin, small, petite. And they look at her like this and are like, you're doing physical training for me? Come on. And they actually seek out young, petite women like this because her endurance and her strength and her personality blows them away. They can't outrun. They can't do more pull-ups or sit-ups. They might be able to lift more weight, but their endurance and per body size, their strength doesn't match hers. So they pick people like this because it helps to motivate the soldiers, because they don't want to fail in front of Gabi. And while they might have a certain amount of tension if it was another big macho guy who was standing there yelling at them like you have in all the movies about the sergeant yelling at the soldiers, that's not her style, and she knows how to motivate them. She doesn't have to go on the 10-kilometer run with full gear with them, but she does, because she's invested in their success. But I jumped ahead because Gabi knew that she had difficulties with authority, and she realized right out of high school that she might not be ready to go into the army and go through basic training and be taking orders. Of course, now she's at a spot where she's giving orders and she's in heaven. But the training, taking orders, wasn't easy for her. So she decided to do what was called a Shnat Sherut, like Shana Tova, Shnat Sherut, Ephos Shirutim, where the restrooms, but it actually means service, okay? A year of service, okay? Where there are all kinds of programs, a gap year program between high school and the army, where you can volunteer to work in all kinds of different settings. She got accepted to a very elite program called Nitzana, which is down at the corner of Gaza, Egypt, and Israel, near a place called Kadesh Barnea that you may have heard of because it comes up a number of times in the Torah, in the Bible. And she was at a youth village, and she did training to become a desert guide, looking at archaeology, looking at rocks. Yes, thank you. Knowing the history, but also learning how to work with at-risk youth. And there were 3 populations that were coming to this youth village. First, there were Haredi youth, Ultra-Orthodox youth, who were not making it in yeshiva and at home. All boys, not used to talking to women. Certainly not energetic, attractive, authority figure, little Ethiopian women. Second group was young people who had recently made aliyah from the former Soviet Union without their families. And before they went to university or to job or whatever, this was a place that they were going through absorption, klita, into Israeli society. And the third group were Bedouin youth at risk. Now, all 3 of these groups, at least initially, not long-term for the new immigrants from the former Soviet Union, but the Bedouin and the Haredi are groups that live in bubbles, that have very little contact with anyone outside of their community. And the new immigrants also, at least initially in their aliyah, they don't have the Hebrew language, right? They're being absorbed usually in places where they have family and other connections, and they're living in that bubble until they get comfortable enough to go outside of it. And that takes a period of time. So all of them are coming together now, and Gabi, because of her connection with animals, was given special training to work in the farm area with the animals. where what they were doing was the kind of thing, do they do like horse therapy here? Right? Right? There's a connection. Horses can read people in a way that's magical. Donkeys can do that too. Her favorite animals are donkeys. Okay? I've got dozens of pictures of Gabi with her donkeys. She got there, and one of the donkeys before she got there was named Gabi. So she had a very special, they were the two Gabis. Gavriella, Gabi. So she would teach them responsibility, how to connect with their emotions, how to connect with other people with respect, through taking care of the goats and the chickens and the rabbits and all the different animals, feeding them, finding out if they were sick, if there was anything going on. And they learned to connect with each other. So she tells some amazing stories of that experience. For example, there was one of the things that happens is when you're working at this kind of a youth village, which is kind of modeled off of a kibbutz, agriculture is key. If you want to get anywhere, you have to know how to drive a tractor. In the old days on kibbutz, you learned to drive a tractor by driving a tractor, with or without permission. Today, you have to get the tractor license, especially if you're at an organized licensed youth village. So there were two kids who were selected to get their license. One was Haredi. So it meant that they had to go on a regular basis, get in a car with one of the other guys. They had to go to the place where they got lessons to learn how to drive a tractor. And they would stop for coffee. And every once in a while she would go with them. And she was friends, she was a counselor for both of them. And she would talk about how initially one would sit, as far as they could on one side of the car in the back seat, and the other one would sit, they wouldn't look at each other. They would both be looking out the window. And eventually they connected. And when they had to do the written test, a lot of unspoken competition going on. What if he passes? Passed the first time. And that strengthened their bond even more. So she was at a youth village connecting, not only learning about people. Now, Gabi had grown up in a bubble as well, on a kibbutz in central Israel, on a hippie kibbutz where she's not the only kid that doesn't look like her parents, where we have diversity in all kinds of forms, where we have single parent by choice families, where we have lesbian, gay families, we have lots of adopted families with adopted children. You name it, we've got it. We have trans, we have everything on the kibbutz. So she grew up in her own kind of bubble. So meeting with the Haredi and the new immigrants and the Bedouin was also complicated for her. So exactly a year ago, my family was celebrating Thanksgiving in Kansas City. And I found out just a few weeks beforehand that they were going to all be together in Kansas City. My brother and sister and cousins and people were coming from all over the place. And it was just a month before Gabi was going into the army. And I'm thinking, I should take her. Right? It was just after they had really opened things up to the point where people were traveling, but not to the point where the tickets had gotten really expensive yet. So I was able to get a good deal. Then I said to Gabi, how about we go to Kansas City? But then I called my friend, Rabbi Stephanie Kramer, at one of the large Reform congregations in Kansas City, and I said, "What do you have going on the Friday night before Thanksgiving?" She said, "Nothing. What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, it's not what I want to do. I want to have with my daughter, I want us to give a joint sermon on Friday night." I said, "Gavriella, the price of your ticket to go to Kansas City and see all the family and get spoiled rotten by your grandmother is you have to speak with me at the synagogue on Friday night." She's like, "Oof, Abba, no." She agreed to it because she's an outgoing kid who knows how to talk. She trained to be a guide. When they had fundraisers that would come, funders who would come into this village, she would be one of the people they would ask to show them. So I was confident that it was going to be something interesting. And we worked together, and it was kind of a question and answer. And one of the questions I asked her was, "So what have you learned? How has this changed you? This experience at the youth village for 10 months. And she said, when I used to go out with my friends and we would get on a bus or we'd be walking around or sitting in a restaurant and the people next to me would start talking in Arabic, I would be on kind of alert, heightened senses. Simply because I didn't understand the language and because of the reality in Israel and because of the programming that happens intentionally and unintentionally in terms of how we relate to our neighbors and our fellow citizens of Israel who are Palestinian, who are Arabs. She would say, I'm on heightened alert. She said, but after spending this time at Nitzana, at this youth village, where not only did I work with Bedouin young people and get to know them and be around Arabic all day long, I also had partners as counselors who were Bedouin. And the other day I was on the bus and somebody behind me started talking in Arabic. She said, and Abba, I realized I haven't talked to Muhammad in a long time, who was a counselor with me. And I need to call him. It changed her life. It changed the way she relates to other people. Haredi, Bedouin. Somebody who's different from her. The army, by the way, is doing that same thing. You know, you have these moments with your children where it's like, oh my God, you're a real person. Right? Like something happened along the way. So we've been talking a lot about politics lately, as you may well imagine. Not so different from what's going on here. Although your results were a little bit, well, I don't want to get into it. Okay. It's complicated, right. But in the bubble where she grew up, in our community, it's a center-left community in Israeli politics, for the most part. Soldiers are right of center as a group, by nature. There's all kinds of sociological reasons why that's the case. But one of the talking points of Smotrich, okay, I don't know how closely you follow, but of ultra-nationalist Orthodox party, one of his talking points on the campaign was, our soldiers shouldn't have to worry about going through investigations every time they have to shoot a terrorist. My politics is I don't think it's a bad thing anytime I fire my gun to have to be able to explain what happened and why. Police officers, right, in a perfect world have to do that just as well. There's no reason a soldier shouldn't have to go through the same thing. But, on the other hand, part of the reality of Israeli society is we need soldiers. You know, I have a friend, some of you may have met, Sally Kleinkatz, Sally and Michael Kleinkatz, who live in Jerusalem. From their balcony in Jerusalem, not far from Kehilat Birkat, if you've ever been there, you can see the barrier, the wall that was built to stop terrorists from coming in. And Sally would say, every morning when I wake up and I stick my nose out the window onto the little balcony by my bedroom just to see, is it cold today? Is it cloudy? Is it going to rain? How should I dress? I see that wall, and I'm torn, because on the one hand, I know for a fact that that wall is saving lives. On the other hand, I also know that I have friends who are Arab, whose lives have been made much more difficult, and families have been separated because of that wall. Instead of a 5-minute walk to go visit my sister or my mother or my cousin or my brother, it takes me a couple of hours now to go around and through a complicated checkpoint. How do we hold that? And for those checkpoints and for everything that we need for security, it means that we have mandatory conscription into the army, into the military, which means that there are 18-year-old kids if they're not in an elite unit, after minimal basic training, are handed an M16 and sent to a checkpoint or to someplace else. And on the one hand, you don't want somebody to be trigger happy. On the other hand, you don't want somebody to hesitate if something does need to be done. And how do you balance that? My friend Amos has a group of people that he's been involved with where they go into duty as mature, experienced reserve combat soldiers to serve in some of those places where the 18-year-olds are, to model for them, instead of having a 19-year-old with an M16, to have a 50 or a 60-year-old with the M16 standing next to them in charge and helping them to understand how we make those decisions, what it means to be responsible, and concerned about security, but also compassionate when I'm at that checkpoint. It's complicated. It's really, really. But I have hope. So Gavi now is talking politics, because so many of those Israeli soldiers heard, oh, now we're not going to get investigated. God forbid we have to pull the trigger. My life isn't going to get turned upside down. So I'll vote for them. They didn't consider anything else. They didn't know any of the other policies or politics. They weren't voting from a level of knowledge that I would want someone to vote from. That's the curse of democracy, right? You know, I remember somebody used to say, why did Clinton win? Some people because he was good looking, some people because they thought he inhaled, some people because they thought he didn't inhale, right? Everybody had different reasons, but at the end, it was a popularity contest. Right? It's marketing. You know, what was the Spaceballs, the lunchbox, right? If you're Mel Brooks fans. It was all about marketing. But they didn't understand necessarily the policies. And she was talking to them about, Wait, do you understand what this means? Do you understand? Forget about Bibi. Bibi has become the center now, the centrist, right, of the right bloc. Whoever would have imagined? And there are a lot of things about Bibi that he has done that have been wonderful for the state of Israel, and he has served. I think his time for serving, I think it's time to let somebody else serve. But I sure wouldn't want to be in his shoes right now in terms of having to manage this bloc. Right? Because I don't think he fully understood who he was getting into bed with in terms of supporting particularly Gvir and Smutrich, who were talking about legalizing gender segregation in the public sector in Israel, who were talking about closing down soccer games and basketball games and making sure that there's no public transportation at all in Israel on Shabbat, who have already decided to double the stipends, the funding that goes to ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students at the expense of increase in salaries of our soldiers. Things that are complicated, and things that my 20-year-old daughter is talking with her peers about in the army. It's complicated, and yet there are these sparks of light. I want to say a couple more words, and then I want to maybe open up for some questions. Next week in the Torah portion, we have one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible. God was in this place, and I did not know it. Right? Jacob's out in the desert. He falls asleep. He has the dream with the stairway going up to the heavens. And he wakes up, and he had a rock as a pillow, and he wakes up in the middle of the desert with a rock for the pillow, and he says, who would have figured? God is in this place. I never imagined that this could be where I'm going to find holiness. I have found so much holiness at Birkat Shalom at Kibbutz Gezer. I initially didn't want to take the job. I felt, as a board member of the synagogue, I didn't feel like I was the right choice to be the spiritual leader. Not that I'm not a great, good-looking, interesting rabbi. But I felt that they needed a great, good-looking native Hebrew speaker and someone who grew up in Israel, who not only spoke the language without all the grammatical mistakes and with the horrible accent, in spite of the fact that Golda did a lot as prime minister with an accent just like mine, and grammar not so much better than mine. But I felt like I wasn't what we needed. I was outvoted. And I'm so glad that I was. By the end of 2022, in a few weeks, we will have had 62 bar and bat mitzvahs in the year 2022 at our little congregation. It doesn't translate into the size of the congregation. We're a regional congregation on the kibbutz, and people from the center of Israel come to us when they need religious support, when they need life cycle events. But being Jewish in Israel is very different than being Jewish in Charlotte or in Kansas City or in Berlin or Moscow or anyplace else. Because we're living immersed in a Jewish country, not only because of the majority population being Jewish, but because the land is based on our roots. Kadesh Barnea, Kibbutz Gezer, Modi'in are all places that come up in the Bible over and over again. If I want to learn the history of where I live, I have to read some Bible in order to fully understand the beauty and the importance of the history of where I'm living, and that it's connected with the Maccabees, or it's connected with King Solomon and the Fertile Crescent and the King's Highway so just because of where my children live, they have a grasp of Jewish history and Bible that I wish and they would define themselves, in spite of the fact that their father is a rabbi, they would define themselves as secular Israelis. But secular Israelis, in the past 2 weeks, we've had 2 different groups with over 100 kids and parents coming from local secular schools to do a project called a Tekes Kabbalat Torah, a ceremony for receiving the Torah. So in a secular school in Israel, depending on the school, either in 2nd grade or in 4th grade, the curriculum has you starting to learn Bible. Not with a rabbi, whether it's a rabbi with an earring who's a Reform rabbi, or not a rabbi who's a Haredi black hat, right? But from a literary, cultural, historical perspective, how it connects with being an Israeli, living in Kibbutz Gezer, where Gezer was built, the archaeological site by King Solomon, and the Maccabees were there. And it's a 10-minute drive from Gezer to Modi'in. And that has Monians, and the whole story of that Hanukkah that we're going to be reading in a little bit is connected. That's part of my story, of my home. So in order to learn the story, where in Kansas I studied Jesse James and the Lewis and Clark Trail and Native Americans and cowboys, right? My kids have to learn about Solomon, a little bit of Torah. And it used to be that the kids would go to Kfar Chabad, and then a rabbi with the black hat and the payas and the black coat would mumble a few words, and then the teachers would give the kids the Torah. And they realized that in our neighborhood, there's a rabbi and has a degree in education. Talk to kids and their parents and make it a little bit more interesting. Not only that, but also doesn't perpetuate the feeling that authentic Judaism belongs to the Ultra-Orthodox. For too many Israelis, they have rejected Judaism, not culturally, but religiously, because the only religious Judaism that they know about is Ultra-Orthodox, that they know that's not for me. Today, we've got over 60 Reform congregations in Israel. We're not the only ones having success with our Bar and Bat Mitzvah program. And while I've become known as the Bar Mitzvah Rabbi, there's a woman rabbi who's known as the Wedding Rabbi. And she's constantly doing wedding ceremonies. People from all over the country come to her because she does a Jewish, spiritual, religious ceremony, but in a way that they never dreamed was possible. That's what we're doing with Bar and Bat Mitzvahs. And I got to tell you, when we have the Yemenite or Moroccan grandmother, and a couple weeks before, I don't know if you maybe heard me tell this before, a couple weeks before the ceremony, the parents come in and they say, Rabbi Steve, I don't know how to tell you this, but we haven't told Safta, we haven't told Grandma yet that the bar mitzvah is at a Reform synagogue, because we don't know how she's going to react. But she grew up more traditional. She may not like it, and we're worried. But you got to tell her before the day of the ceremony, right? And so then I said, so how about you bring her to the rehearsal. And she walks in, and I'm up on the bima with the grandson. And when she first walks in, she's trying to figure out, wait, where do the women sit? Right? Are those is that the mechitza and it's just over on the side and we need to pull it out? Because I obviously can't sit, with the men. Say, Savta, come, just sit right here. Rabbi said I can sit here, I'm sitting here. And then I'm up here with David, and we're reading from the Torah, and we've got the Torah out, and I can see that she is so familiar with the text, she's mouthing the words without having it in front of her as he's reading from the Torah. And I say, Savta, come here. Come up, come join. Come join your grandson. And look, stand next to him while he's reading it. And she's like, are you serious? And she comes on up. And then we finish the section he's working on, and I said, you know what? He needs to know there are going to be Torah blessings here. I said, how about, here's the blessings. How about if you read the Torah blessing? Savta starts crying. Shaking, crying. And I don't know if I pushed the envelope a little bit too far. The parents are freaking out. Little David doesn't know what the hell's going on. And Savta then says, I never dreamed of the possibility that I could stand next to my grandson as he reads from the Torah, that I could give a blessing for the Torah reading. She grabs my hand and she says, thank you. Changing people's lives with the work we're doing in the Reform. The families coming to the Tekas Kabbalat Torah, the people coming for the bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies. Right? We're averaging 70 to 80 people at each ceremony. Over 60 a year, you do the math. Next year, I'm expecting to get to 75 ceremonies. I don't know how I'm going to do anything but bar and bat mitzvahs. But these are good problems to have. We're at a problem right now. I had a meeting with our leadership. The last thing I ever wanted to have to do as a rabbi was worry about a capital campaign, and we may have to consider, we've only been in our building 6 years. We're considering whether or not we need to, in the not too distant future, expand a little bit, because 3 times in the last 2 weeks we're lucky that our building was designed with a wall here that's sliding glass doors. Inside the sanctuary, if it's jam-packed full of chairs, we can fit 70 people. If we open those glass doors, there's a beautiful deck outside, and we can fit more people. I want to expand the deck and maybe close that off. Right now, with the new government, I'm worried about the little bit of support we're getting from the government to help with programming and building and expenses that we're going to lose. I don't know how we'll dream of being able to expand, but these are the problems we should have. And I want to focus on those problems and not on the Knesset. Because I know that we're having an impact on Israeli society. We're teaching people the Jewish values of Derech Eretz Kedma LaTorah. Right? Being a mensch, being a good person is the most important thing. The first step about connecting with Torah. Everything else is trying to help us get there. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. The kids are always shocked, and the parents are shocked even more when I teach about tefillin, right? Wrapping the tefillin, right? It should be a sign on your hand, frontlets between the symbol before your eyes. And I say, after we do a whole lot of talk about the tefillin, I tell the kids, when I take off the tefillin, I have lines on my arm from where it was wrapped. And I tell them, for me, the most important part about putting on tefillin is taking it off and having those lines stay part of me. Because that's going to be with me now for 45 minutes or an hour, and hopefully a lifetime, as a reminder. This is what shocks them. I say, I don't think she really cares if I put on tefillin every day. But I know she cares if I'm a good person. And if when I talk to you and when I interact with the world, if I'm living according to the values of Derech Eretz Kedma, the Torah, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Be a good person. And that's what the tefillin is reminding me. It's a reminder on my arm before my eyes. What's it reminding me about? To be a good person in the way I interact with the world. That's what we're trying to do with the Reform movement. The project that my daughter went to at Nitzana, there are several mechinot, pre-military gap year programs now run by the Israel Reform movement that do parallel things to what she did in the desert. But they're doing it in South Tel Aviv and in other places. But the same kind of thing, working with foreign workers, working with refugees, working with at-risk populations, and living our values. That's what we're trying to do, but it's complicated. I'm going to stop for a second and see if you have any questions, and I'm going to do my best to repeat the questions when you ask them, so that the people who are with us online know what the questions are. Anything?
Are there any basic educational requirements, whether you go to a secular school or not, that the state expects in terms of being, well, we don't have data education here, in terms of understanding numbers very well, and talking beyond where that's at. But in terms of civics,
What happens in the school system in terms of education related to civics? Okay? It's complicated. So, yes, it is part of the curriculum, but, for example, it's like statistics. Anybody who's ever worked with statistics knows that you can make the numbers say whatever you want to make the numbers say. It's got to do with the person who's running the numbers and how they work the system. So I can take Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I have heard Ultra-Orthodox and nationalists, not Ultra-Orthodox, but Orthodox colleagues who say, the text is, when it says a neighbor, it's talking about Jews, our fellow Jews. It's not talking about somebody who's not Jewish. Now, how do you argue with that? So in the civics class, I can teach that every citizen of the state of Israel and 23% roughly of the citizens of the state of Israel are not Jewish. They're Muslim, they're Christian, they're Baha'i, they're Druze, there are, mostly Christian and Muslim, okay? But roughly 23%. They have theoretically all the rights of a Jewish citizen of the state of Israel. That's theoretical. Right? We all know from our history here in the United States that just because we make a law that says, okay, everybody's equal now, doesn't mean that that's the way it necessarily plays out. So some of the teachers, in the way they teach the civics, what it means to have a shared society, do it justice as far as I'm concerned. Too many don't. Complicated. Yeah.
Is there
Ah.
Or is everything based on the Torah?
Okay, so there's no separate. Is there a constitution? How does the legal system work in Israel? It's complicated. So there was, at the founding of the state of Israel, there was what was called the Basic Laws. There was a constitution committee formed that never did anything. Because of a debate about what's the role of religion in state. How do we define it? And it never got defined. So there were some basic laws of freedom, and there were some things that had been in play under the British mandate that they said, we're just going to continue that. That's the main reason why I can't legally do a wedding in Israel. Under the British mandate, there were certain Orthodox groups, or certain groups within every religion that were given a booklet that had marriage licenses. Okay? And when you finished your book, you could go to the office and they would give you another book. And those got passed down. And there were no Reform rabbis that ever got a book. Because our mistake as Reformed Jews was in the 40s and 50s, we weren't there. Right? The history of the Reform movement with Zionism was, this is the new Zion. Right here. Right? It's fine for our poor cousins, but we don't need it. And who's to say that that's a better place to live? It evolved over time, but it's complicated. There was never a constitution. One of the biggest challenges with the new government, as far as I am concerned, is they are also planning, as soon as a Knesset is formed, which is one of the main reasons Bibi is dragging his feet on, in spite of the fact that he's talking about the ministerial positions, is they want to introduce legislation in the Knesset that will pull the rug out from underneath the Supreme Court of Israel. And that if the Knesset disagrees with decisions of the Supreme Court, that they could basically legislate and, dismiss any decision that they disagree with. Primarily relating to things concerning the Reform movement. Jewish identity, conversion, weddings, funding for Reform congregations. We've made some tremendous, now, I have to say, I wish we had in Israel separation of religion and state. I really do. I also have to keep in mind that it's not unusual. Israel is far from the only place that doesn't have it. Most of Europe, right, there's government and worship, religious bodies are mixed, and there's government funding and there's connections. I wish it was separated. That's the way that I grew up here. As long as it's not separated, I want to, as much as possible, level the playing field, because I want to get to more than 60 and more than 75. I want the percentage of bar and bat mitzvahs to level out instead of bar mitzvahs up here and bat mitzvahs down here. And the only way I can do that is if I have the same opportunities and funding and infrastructure that my Orthodox colleagues have. And right now I don't have it. But with the little bit we have gotten as a movement, we're having a major impact on Israeli society, and that's scaring them. So that's why this whole thing with the Supreme Court really, really makes me nervous. And Bibi Netanyahu is smart enough to understand that that's dangerous for the future of Israel as a democratic society. Live in interesting times.
You talking about when
curious on how you define terms. Is a reform in Israel? Are there reform, what we would recognize as a reform congregation, what we would recognize as a conservative movement, not an orthodox but not ultra-orthodox group, or are we talking about you either ultra-orthodox or you're this reform movement? How are the terms defined?
So, definitions, and how do we culturally translate the different ways of being Jewish that we're familiar with here? I'm going to expand it not only to Israel, but to other parts of the world. Okay? Here we've got, most people are familiar with it. There's more than one way to be Jewish. You can be Orthodox. You can be Chabad. You can be Reconstructionist, secular humanist, conservative, Reform. What were the Yiddish speakers? The Bund, right? There were lots of different ways to identify and connect with Jewish life. So one of the sessions that I do with my bar mitzvah families is talking about the differences between the streams in Judaism. And one of the keys on the differences is based on how do I relate to two different things. One is God, and two is Torah. And what's the relationship between God and Torah? And we talk about Torah being given by God at Mount Sinai, passed from generation to generation. And is the Torah that we have today in our Aron Kodesh, in our Ark, is that exactly the same Torah that God gave to Moses word for word on Mount Sinai? Not only the Torah, but also all the explanations around it. Where it says in the Torah you shouldn't boil a kid in its mother's milk, but it doesn't say anything about chicken parmesan. Right? But according to the Orthodox, the explanations about chicken parmesan and that you have to have separate sets of dishes, and also another couple of sets of dishes for Passover, and then if you live in Boston, another set of dishes in the garage for lobster, right? All that, according to the Orthodox, is passed down also from God to Moses, dating back to Sinai. The streams, Orthodox, and within Orthodox, lots of variations, not only Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, or Sephardi, but, Yemenite or Egyptian Jews, Jews from Lithuania and Jews from Belarus, right? There are synagogues that have the flavors of what shtetl they came from in the old country, wherever that old country was. And they would all define themselves as Orthodox. Some of them would define themselves as Masorti, but then it gets complicated because Masorti, which translates as traditional, is also the global name, the international name of the conservative movement. Where here in the States it's known as conservative, but globally it's Masorti. Reform is known globally sometimes as Reform, sometimes as progressive, and sometimes as liberal. And in the UK, you've got Reform, progressive, and liberal that are all under the same umbrella, but each one different. Reconstructionist, everywhere except in the United States, is also under the umbrella of the global Reform progressive movement. But within the United States, URJ and the Reconstructionist Federation are separate. I have for years said, if anybody really wanted to get rid of the Jews, just leave us alone. We'll take care of it ourselves. Right? If we had the time not to worry about outside forces, we would just kill each other. We would keep creating more and more streams and finding more and more way to fight and argue with each other. So within Israel, sometimes there are different ways of being Jewish, but it doesn't translate the exact same. You would come to my congregation, many people come to my congregation in Israel, and they think, this is the weirdest thing. I recognize all the melodies and the songs, or most of them, because I've heard them here as well. But it's not Reform, because the whole thing's in Hebrew. Except we're in Israel. What else would it be? Right? And there's no separate, right? The ideology and the theology is the same, the way it looks, just like, you have today conservative synagogues with musical instrumentation and conservative without. You have Reform synagogues where sometimes people will put on tefillin, and Reform synagogues where nobody's, including the rabbi, is wearing a kippah. Right? So there is, within each movement, there is also a spectrum. I'm very proud that today there are more and more Israelis for whom the synagogue they don't go to is a Reform synagogue. Because it used to be the synagogue they didn't go to was exclusively an Orthodox synagogue. Not sure if that answers your question, but the movements exist. They're conservative and Reform. We have our own, we have rabbinic programs for each one of the movements. There's also another movement that probably most of you have never heard of called the Karaim, the Karaites. Okay, Karaite, the Mikra, Likro, the word to read, comes from text. Okay? The Torah is the text. They follow the text of the Torah, the chicken parmesan within the Karaites, which is an ancient, traditional sect of Judaism. Chicken parmesan is fine. A cheeseburger is fine if it's a beef burger and goat cheese, because there's no chance that you're the kid in its mother's milk. Right? It's strict interpretation of the biblical text without all this, right? So it exists and it's parallel, but right. Other questions? Right, I want to see if there's anybody who hasn't asked, though, before we let seconds. Yes?
Just wondering, other than when your children step outside of the bubble that you describe, they live in diversity and so on, they face racial discrimination in a particular way?
Yes, and. My kids, growing up on kibbutz is amazing. It's a sense, the question was, my kids, when they step out of the bubble, I'm doing pretty good, right? When the kids step out of the bubble, what happens? Racism, right? Discrimination. For me, like, of course, they can't hide the fact that they're Ethiopian. I always want to know, so wait, did you tell him your dad's a Reform rabbi? That for me, that's always the big question. I actually, Gavi, they invited me down. She invited me to come to the youth village during her year of service there, to come and talk. I have a presentation that I do about the differences between the streams of Judaism, right? For the Orthodox, the Torah that we got at Sinai, including all the explanations, is what we have today. For conservative, it's mostly the same, but there might be some scribal errors along the way, and maybe some changes or additions that are divinely inspired. For Reform, I'm not always sure whether I believe in God, or maybe I believe in God, but I'm not sure if I believe in Moses. But somehow this became our collective, the story of our people, and that's what makes it holy. So talking about those relationships and where God or godliness or holiness fits in, and it's a very interactive thing. And she had me come down to talk to them about different ways of being Jewish, how to understand that on a slightly more intellectual level. But back to the question about racism. So growing up on kibbutz, it's like growing up in a huge extended family, right? Where you've got dozens of brothers and sisters. Okay? Older, younger, your own age. And I don't know what it was like in your family, but my brother and I fought constantly. But you better not mess with him, because I've got his back. Right? Nobody messes with my brother, and he was the same way about me. Right? So when they went to school, God helped the kid who used a racial slur against one of my kids. Because suddenly all the kids from the kibbutz were there making sure they understood, that's not acceptable. At the swimming pool at Gezer, years ago when we first started having people who don't live on the kibbutz who could buy a membership for the summer to be able to come and use the pool. Sue, who is this amazing woman who for many years ran the swimming pool. Sue is a tough lady, right? You wouldn't want to run into her, on the street, and get into it with Sue. Sue heard somebody use a racial slur against one of my kids. I felt bad for that kid at the end of the day. They're absolutely facing it. My son, something about his autism and his demeanor, he is just the biggest sweetheart and teddy bear you would ever find. And the minute you look at him, you know that. So he doesn't have problems that way, or very, very rarely. He also, social cues doesn't always pick up the same way that neurotypical people do. So sometimes it might happen, but he's not even aware that somebody may have, underhandedly somehow said something inappropriate. My daughter, there are times when she is, don't mess with her, because she's, despite her size, she knows how to take care of herself. And there are other times when, depending on the mood she's in, something might happen, and it just breaks her. And she plays what I woulda, shoulda, coulda said and done, and relives it over and over again to learn how to do it better the next time. But in the States, we talk a lot about what it means to have privilege, the buzzwords. And my kids have privilege, in spite of the fact that their skin is black and that they are born of Ethiopian descent. They're hippie, kibbutz, Ashkenazi, American Reform kids. Right? Their whole, right? Somebody comes up and talks to one of them. The minute they start talking back, they don't talk. They don't, I can't think of the word. Their demeanor, they don't act, they don't present, other than the color of their skin, as Ethiopian. I don't know if that makes sense. And I apologize also because that's to some degree stereotyping Ethiopians and saying they're not. They certainly are, and not all Ethiopians fit that stereotype either. My kids are not alone within the Ethiopian community not fitting into that stereotype. And the community is coming of age, has come of age, I should say. When we adopted our kids 20 plus years ago, when we started the adoption process, we were told that it can take years to adopt in Israel. And then we found out that it takes years because so many Israelis, when they go to adopt, they say, okay, I want an infant, I want a girl, I want no history of physical or mental illness, and they have a checklist. When we went in, our checklist was, we want a baby. Giving birth is a crapshoot, right? It's the same thing, except, no cravings and, whatever. So there are now, at that time, there were a lot of Ethiopian babies in the system. Because of Operation Moses and Solomon, when they came in, there were so many young people who came without parents or without grandparents, without support systems. They were put into absorption centers. There were a lot of young, unplanned pregnancies and ended up with babies in the system. Today, and there weren't Ethiopian families who were settled and at a point where they could even consider adoption for them wasn't, they were looking at survival. Today, there are Ethiopian families adopting Ethiopian children. And there are far, far fewer in the system. So that's also a change. So that's a sign that there are people who are doctors and attorneys and architects, right? We've got second and third generation Ethiopian now within Israeli society who are, so it's changing. The landscape is changing. And it was less, one of the debates within the Ethiopian community and within the community at large around racism in Israel is, to what degree is it racism and to what degree is it discrimination against new immigrants? Because if you talk about people coming from Egypt or Iran, Iranian Jews, when they came to Israel, or Jews coming from the former Soviet Union, or any wave of immigration faced discrimination. My family ended up in Kansas City because of what was called the Galveston movement. I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but in the late 1800s, the Jews in New York and Boston and Philadelphia were feeling finally settled. Not everybody knows that I'm Jewish and I can start to be around with my neighbors and go to the restaurants with them. And now there's a new wave of Jews that want to come after more pogroms in Lithuania and in Belarus and in other places. And instead of welcoming them with open arms, they said, how about you go down to Texas? We'll pay the extra. You'll go through Galveston, and then we'll send you to the Midwest and to California. Right? If you ever saw the Frisco Kid, right? Let's get them away from the coast because I'm finally feeling settled and I don't need you to cramp my style. Right? So there was discrimination within the Jewish community in America against the next wave of immigrants coming in. So financially, what's happening with the congregation, especially considering the number of bar mitzvahs? It's been a significant help. At the same time, the numbers went up when COVID hit. One of our primary sources of income has always been fundraising. And one of the best ways that we've always done fundraising isn't only when I come to visit communities and where we have long-standing relationships with the congregation and with individuals within your community who have been very generous over the years helping to support the work that we're doing. But when groups come, and I certainly would love to host a group from Temple Solel, when you're ready to do an Israel trip, or when the singles group is ready to do an Israel trip, and you'll come and you'll have Friday night with us, and you'll join us for Shabbat services, And depending on the size of the group and the time of year, either we'll do a catered dinner then afterwards, or a potluck dinner at the synagogue, or we'll do home hospitality if it's a small enough group, and divide you up, and everybody will go to homes of people for dinner, and then you'll go back. Unfortunately, we don't have guest housing, but then you'd go back to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or wherever you're staying. But that's been a way over the years, hosting those groups, that we have generated income. If we make, $300, $500, or $1,000, depending on all kinds of factors for each group that comes, that helps us with our budget, suddenly there were no groups. And suddenly I couldn't travel to do more friend-raising and fundraising. And out of each of those groups, if from each group we were able to find one, besides the rabbi and what they gave, but if we somehow connected with one person in the group who said, you know what, whether I can give $360 or $1,000 or $36, right? That was a way that helped us. So the bar mitzvahs significantly helped us, and we're hoping that the numbers of groups are now going to go back up, and that they're not going to then pull out the funding, the limited government funding that we get, where then that means that we'd get the groups back, stick with the bar mitzvahs, but still be at a disadvantage because we lost the government funding, which would be devastating, because we won't be able to make that up. It's complicated. I have no idea what time it is and how long I've been speaking, but I have a feeling that if there aren't any other questions, that we should probably bring this to a close. Wait, let me see if I have anything that is really good that I didn't mention, that I put down in my notes. No, the only thing I'll say is I mentioned at the beginning, or in the middle at some point, God is in this place, and I did not know it. It's part of a story where Yaakov, goes through a transformation with his identity. And gets a new name, right? He becomes Yisrael, and we are the children of Israel. We're all going through journeys and through transformations. And we're having an impact on Israeli society. And I just want to say thank you for allowing us, for helping us, for being our partners for so many years, in so many ways, to help us make a difference and to help continue that transformation. And I hope that we all continue this spiritual journey, remembering Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to love all of our neighbors. Thank you.